What makes an elf an elf? Of all the mythological creatures, elves have the most varied identity, and people are really passionate about the different versions. If I said to you Tolkien elves, you'd probably imagine the tall, majestic, mean girls of fantasy lore. But if I said Christmas elves, you'd probably see the short, legging-wearing curly shoe version helping Santa make the toys. And then there's the creepy elf. So what are elves? Where did they come from? And why are there so many different versions? Welcome to the mysteries of mythology, elves. The forge glows red hot, casting the cavernous workshop in a flickering dance of shadows and light. Sparks fly as the hammer meets anvil, each strike ringing out with the promise of perfection. Völund, the master craftsman, works tirelessly. His creations are unmatched in beauty and power. Yet, beyond his focused gaze simmers a rage, not born of fire, but of betrayal. Once free, he was hailed as the greatest of elves, his brilliance admired by his peers and envied by mortals. Among these mortals was King Nithithur, whose fear of Völund's skill drove him to a cruel act of treachery. One fateful night, the king sent his men to capture the unsuspecting craftsman. Shackled and bound, Völund was dragged before the royal court. There his captors severed the tendons behind his knee, a brutal measure to ensure his imprisonment. He was forced to forge treasures for the king, a crown, a ring, a sword, all magnificent, yet tainted by the agony of their creation. But Völund was no mere craftsman. He was a creator of destiny. He waited, biding his time, his mind as sharp as his blades. With each piece he forged, he laid the foundation for a terrible revenge. When the moment came, his vengeance was as calculated as it was brutal. The king's sons, innocent and trusting, wandered into Völund's forge, their eyes wide with wonder at all of his creations. But they never left. Völund tricked the boys into peering into one of his treasure chests. As they leaned over to look inside, Völund slammed the lid shut, decapitating them on the sharpened edge. From their remains, Völund crafted jewellery, skulls turned into goblets, teeth to gleaming ornaments, and their blood made into wine. The king, oblivious to the origins, drank proudly from the goblets forged from his own son's skulls, and adorned himself with ornaments made from their teeth, all while praising Völund's unparalleled skill. The king's daughter also became an unwitting part of Völund's revenge. Visiting the forge with a broken ring, she asked Völund to repair it. Völund took the ring, turning it over carefully by the firelight. Recognizing it as the missing ring he had once crafted for his beloved wife, he agreed, his expression unreadable. He offered the princess a drink, speaking kindly to put her at ease, and then another, until her senses began to blur. Intoxicated and unable to resist, she was assaulted by Völund. She left the forge carrying his child, an act of violence and revenge that sealed her father's ruin. Meanwhile, the king celebrated his ill-gotten wealth, but Völund waited until the very end before he unveiled the final act of his plan. Intricately forged from gold, Völund crafted wings made of mechanical feathers. They carried him high into the heavens, beyond the reach of his captors. As he soared away, his voice thundered down like a curse over the king's palace, revealing to the king the horrors he had wrought on his children. The king's family, now broken and humiliated, watched helplessly as Völund disappeared into the horizon. a free elf once more. The story of Völund is a disturbing one, and it has a strong message: don't mess with elves. It comes from the poem Völundarkvida, or the Lay of Völund in the Poetic Edda, written between the 10th and 13th centuries. And it's the only time a character is explicitly referred to as an elf. Völund is described as a prince among the elves and a master craftsman. Before Völund's capture, he and his two brothers were married to Valkyries, the winged warrior women serving Odin, king of the Norse gods. I use the term marriage loosely, as I see it more as being held hostage. The Valkyries were bathing by the lake when the brothers stumbled upon them and stole their magic swan skins, which allowed them to travel between worlds. Bound to the earth, the Valkyries married the brothers. After 7 years, the Valkyries reclaimed their swan skins and returned to their original roles. 2 of the brothers left Midgard, or Earth, to search for their wives, but Völund remained, mourning his wife's departure and praying for her return. Maybe he was a Cancerian. Alone in the forge, he made hundreds of golden rings, hoping for his wife's return. Elves, golden rings. Where have I seen that before?
Must have the precious.
Völund is a skilled craftsman, and skill is a common attribute of elves. In the poem Odin's Raven Chant, it begins, All-Father works. Elves understand. Vanir know. Norns reveal. The Norse for elves understand is alfar skilja. The word skilja is related to the English word skill. In Old Norse, it meant something like understand or separate. Its literal translation was to cut or to split. And that kind of makes sense, as to truly understand something, you need to break it down. And there's a lot we can understand when we break down the word elf. Elves are ancient entities, and they weren't just found in Norse mythology. All surviving Germanic languages have some version of the name. The word elf's root is thought to come from the Proto-Indo-European word helbos. Over time, this became the Proto-Germanic albiz or albaz, then elf in Old English, alb in Old High German, alfar in Old Norse, and finally elf as we know it today. The name elf is thought to mean whiteness or shining, and we see this in other languages such as Latin, albus meaning white, and the Greek alphos meaning whiteness. In fact, Albion was the original name for Britain because of the white cliffs of Dover that the first Indo-European speakers saw when they arrived here. Knowing what elves were called and what their names mean gives us some clues to what people thought elves were at the time. Old English medical texts mention a condition called water elf disease, which describes swelling or fevers thought to be caused by elves shooting invisible arrows from water. The same kind of attack from invisible arrows of elves on dry land was called elf shot. Elf shot was thought to cause sudden pains in the body and was also the reason for illness of your cattle. Today we can probably explain elf shot with rheumatism, arthritis or cramps. People who found prehistoric arrowheads thought that they were the same as those used by the elves. A similar idea appears in Gaelic religion, where nearly identical beings called the Dunyashi were also thought to have this power. But if we go back a little earlier, we find clues that suggest elves weren't thought of as evil at all. Many Germanic names included the word elf, such as Elfgeir, meaning elf spear, Alfred, meaning elf advice, Alford, meaning elf guardian, and Elvis, probably meaning elf wise. The use of elf in names shows that they were admired and revered, and we wanted to be associated with them. However, it also shows that while respected, elves were also feared. They could heal, help, and guide us, but they could also make us ill or even kill us. This is perhaps similar to how people adopted the names of animals such as the wolf, which can be admired for its strength and loyalty to its pack, but is also feared for its ferocity. But to get to know elves, there are a few more Norse stories we can explore. In addition to the Poetic Edda, where we found Völund's story, we also have the Prose Edda. This text is our main source of information on Norse mythology and was written, or at least compiled, by the Catholic historian Snorri Sturluson. Even in this later writing, the definition of elves is hazy at best. The difference between elves and other spiritual beings like gods, giants, dwarves, and land spirits isn't clear. The Germanic people probably didn't view these groups in rigid, systematic categories. The difference between elves and the Vanir gods and goddesses is hard to define. Freyr, one of the Vanir gods, is said to rule Alfheimr, meaning the realm of elves. As a god of fertility, prosperity and peace, Freya's connection to Alfheimr reinforces the elves' association with light, abundance, and the natural cycles of growth. One poem even uses the word elves to refer to the Vanir. However, other sources describe them as separate groups, so suggesting the two were the same would be an oversimplification. In Alfheimr, we also find the Ljósalfar, or the Light Elves, who are thought to have a bright and beautiful appearance and a close connection to the gods. The Svartalfar, or the Black Elves, were also believed to be dark in appearance, small and underground. These descriptions of light and dark aren't just physical. They also hint at their influence over realms such as fertility, prosperity, and the mysteries of the underworld, which I'll discuss later. But first, something a little more familiar. In my previous Thor video, I introduced the god of thunder's two servants, the brother and sister Thialfi and Röskva. While Thor and Loki were on their way to the land of the giants, they found shelter at a home of a poor family. The brother of the two children, Thialfi, made a huge mistake and broke one of the god's instructions. Thor had offered his goats for supper on the condition that they would not damage the bones. Thor was able to bring the goats back to life using his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, but his power wasn't able to mend broken bones. The next day, seeing one of his magical goats limping after being brought back to life, Thor was furious. Seeking forgiveness from Thor, Thialfi's parents offered their son as a servant. His sister Röskva joined him so as not to leave him alone. The siblings are often portrayed as human servants, but these two were actually elves, and this is explicitly mentioned in the Old Norse poem Thorstrapa, where it says, "The worshipped Hellstriker, with the elf, slew the wood calves of the subterranean refuge, from the elf world's gleam with the easy crusher." To break this down, Hellstriker is Thor. The elf refers to Thialfi, who was by his side in battle, and the wood calves of the subterranean refuge are the Jotnar, seeking to escape the elf's world gleam, likely a reference to the bright sky or sun. And the easy crusher is Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. To make it even more evident that they were elves, Thialfi's name is thought to contain the root word elf, and may mean serving elf, while Röskva's name translates to quick or energetic. A large mythical being riding a flying vehicle made of wood, pulled by magical animals in a cold, snowy climate and accompanied by his elf helpers. Where have I seen that before? There may be something more symbolic between Thor and his servants. In Norse mythology, elves are often associated with atmospheric and natural phenomena, which might explain their connection to Thor. Thor is closely associated with wind, rain, lightning, and obviously thunder, all key elements of the natural world. They're also regarded as symbols of fertility and may act as agents of these forces, similar to the nymphs of Greek mythology. This could explain their ties to the natural landscapes like fields, downs, and forests. Travelling with elves adds a layer to Thor's myth, including weather, fertility, and natural cycles, implying a deeper connection between these beings and natural forces. When I started researching this video, I wanted to clarify what elves were and where they came from, but thanks to some hazy history, it's not been that easy. Part of the confusion is that elves are often mixed up with two other creatures, dwarves and fairies. Earlier I spoke briefly about the light and the black elves of Alfheimr. Relying on the words of Snorri Snorrelson again, he says, "That which is called Alfheimr is one where dwell the peoples called light elves, but dark elves dwell in the earth. They are unalike in appearance, but by far more unalike in nature. The light elves were fairer to look upon than the sun, but the dark elves were blacker than pitch." It's not entirely clear if Snorri's reference to the dark elves meant that they were literally black, or if this interpretation reflects a symbolic use of dark colours, a point still debated among scholars. A lot of global mythology refers to the underworld symbolically, using dark colours to represent earth and stone. However, the confusion with dwarves happens when Snorri uses the names Svaltalfar or black elves interchangeably with Dvergar or dwarves. It's thought that even before Christianization of the Norse, the lines between dwarves and elves began to blur. But there is one key difference between the two that stays true from the earliest tellings. A dwarf is known as being smaller than a human, whereas an elf is human-sized, if not larger. This distinction even influenced language. The word oaf, which originally meant elf child, became a derogatory term in the Christian period to describe someone large, clumsy, or stupid. Another distinction is that elves love the sun and bright skies, while dwarves are repelled or turned to stone by the sun. It wasn't just the dark elves that were going to have an identity crisis. The light elves were also going to face challenges for a number of reasons. The light elves were said not only to dwell in Freya's kingdom of Alfheimr, linked to the sun and the sky, but also Vifblein, the third heaven where the Hall of Gimle stands. This might tie them to ideas like purity, divinity, immortality, since Vifblein is described as a sanctuary safe from Ragnarok and as a place of ultimate peace and brightness. The residents of Vifblein were said to be safe from Ragnarok, the Norse end of days. Light elves were also considered to be spirits of ancestors who remained on Earth, or Midgard, to help the living, similar to people of the Golden Age that Hesiod wrote about in Greek mythology. This connection positions light elves as mediators between the mortal and spiritual realms, often invoked in rituals or stories to provide guidance, protection, or blessings. And finally, elves were connected to the first men and women created. For example, some myths suggest that elves shaped humanity, acting as divine intermediaries during creation or blessing the first humans with wisdom and light, reflecting their association with life and immortality. And this is why elves also became fairies. When Christianity spread across pagan Europe, it started reshaping the way people saw elves. Stories about old gods and supernatural beings, once shared around fires, began to look suspicious. Pagan beliefs weren't just strange anymore. Sometimes they were seen as outright dangerous. In Germanic folklore, elves didn't escape this scrutiny. They were increasingly labelled as demonic, and the suspicion wasn't helped by a specific attribute of the elves. Elves, associated with fertility, were said to visit women and, well, leave them with more than just stories. That might explain why so many children had elf-related names. Maybe it was a convenient excuse for an inconvenient truth. Either way, elves became a sexual threat, sinful creatures according to Christian clergy. But storytellers weren't ready to let elves fade away. To keep the tales alive, they adapted them. Elves became something in between, not entirely good, but not outright evil either. Some even tried to work elves into Christian theology. Maybe they were neutral angels during the battle between good and evil, or perhaps they were the children of Adam's questionable first wife, Lilith. In the medieval world though, there wasn't much room for shades of grey. things were either good or bad. That narrow middle ground is where elves began to blend with fairies. Fairies' origins are even murkier than those of elves. The word fairy comes from the French fairy, which described magical qualities, tricky, deceitful, and otherworldly. Originally, fairy wasn't used as a name of a creature. Instead, you described an elf as being of fairy, meaning they had magical traits. Over time, the term evolved into a catch-all for nearly all magical beings, including the Irish Ishi. The Ishi was said to be a hidden race of supernatural beings, descendants from the Tuatha De Danann, a central part of Ireland's mythological history. The Tuatha De Danann, often called the Children of Danu, were the fifth legendary group to arrive in Ireland. Danu, a pre-Christian goddess, remains mysterious to us, as there isn't much written about her, but her influence shaped these tales. The Tuatha De Danann were described as tall, beautiful, and skilled in magic and battle. Their arrival was epic. Some stories say they came shrouded in mist, others talk about great ships. Either way, they swiftly defeated the Firbolg, the inhabitants of Ireland at the time. But their story didn't end there. When the Milesians, the ancestors of today's Irish people, arrived, the Tuatha De Danann didn't fight an all-out war. Instead, they retreated into the Shee, the hollow hills and mounds scattered across Ireland. There they faded into legend, becoming the Ishi, otherworldly figures tied to the land. Over centuries, these stories mixed with the Greek, Roman, Scottish, and even Persian myths, and as a result created a melting pot of ideas that reshaped how people imagined magical beings. Eventually, fairy became a one-size-fits-all term, and elves were swept up in it. But then came a writer who loved elves, myths, and languages so much he decided to reshape their history. And he didn't just change how we see elves, he built them an entire world. It's almost impossible to talk about elves without mentioning the famous fantasy author, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, better known as J.R.R. Tolkien. From medieval times to the 1900s, the lines between elves and fairies blurred, especially during the Elizabethan and Victorian eras. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream portrayed fairies as small, clever tricksters, shaping how people imagine both fairies and elves. By the Victorian era, Romanticism took it a step further, shrinking them into tiny childlike beings. Think Tinkerbell or the Cottingley fairy hoaxes. This blending with fairies softened the image of elves, taking them far from their powerful mythological roots. But Tolkien wasn't having any of it. Most people say Tolkien revolutionized how elves were perceived, but honestly, I think a better word is restored. Tolkien went back to the source, Germanic folklore, and brought back the noble, awe-inspiring image of the elf. But even he had challenges with how vague the original stories were. So he filled in the blanks with his own imagination and life experiences, turning myth into something more tangible. Ironically, the same religion that once diminished the worship of Norse gods helped Tolkien rebuild elf mythology. Drawing from his strong Catholic faith, Tolkien reimagined elves as angelic, wise, and untainted beings. Now, if you know a thing or two about Celtic mythology, you might notice some striking similarities between Tolkien's elves and the Tuatha De Danann I mentioned earlier. But Tolkien denied taking any inspiration from Celtic myths, even claiming he disliked Celtic legends altogether. But I'm calling bullshit on that. Tolkien grew up reading about Celtic mythology, and he openly loved the Welsh language, which is of course Celtic in origin. Despite his protests, there are undeniable parallels. Tolkien's elves and the Tuatha De Danann share traits like being tall, fair, strong, and skilled in magic from faraway lands. Tolkien's take on elves laid the foundation for most modern interpretations. Think Elder Scrolls, The Witcher, Dungeons and Dragons, and countless of other franchises. Feel free to drop one of your favourites in the comments. That said, there's still one other type of modern elf we haven't talked about yet. I have a love-hate relationship with Christmas elves. On one hand, Elf, starring Will Ferrell, is one of my favourite Christmas movies. But to be fair, I love anything starring Will Ferrell.
I'm in a glass case of emotion!
But then there are the other Christmas elves, particularly the ones on shelves. Those little guys make me want to run away and hope the house implodes, poltergeist style. Anyway, the best way I can explain how we got Christmas elves is through the 80s movie, Twins. If you haven't seen this 1988 comedy, here's the gist. Scientists tried to create the perfect human in a lab, smart, strong, the whole package. That's Julius, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. But as a side effect, all the leftover traits end up with his twin, Vincent, played by Danny DeVito. So what does twins have to do with elves? Well, Tolkien's elves and Christmas elves come from the same mythological root, but took widely different paths. On one side you've got Tolkien's elves, tall, noble, steeped in ancient lore. They're grand, mystical, and a nod to the original mythological origins. On the other side, you've got Christmas elves, tiny, fairy-like and playful. One of the theories is that Christmas elves came from the same region as the original elves, but from a totally different creature. In Scandinavia, there's a creature called the Nisse. Associated with winter and solstice, they're small, mischievous beings who might help around the house, or wreak havoc on your farm, depending on their mood and how you treat them. Over time, Nisse started appearing in stories as bringers of gifts during Christmas, often accompanied by a goat or a pig, both tied to the Yule traditions. The Victorians picked up on this tradition, and in 1862, a poem in Harper's Weekly officially linked these small creatures, now called elves, with Santa. Then came 1932, when Disney released a short called Santa's Workshop. It was filled with Santa's helper elves, and after that, there was no going back. So, what are elves? There's so much more than the pointy-eared characters we see in modern fantasy. Elves are ancient symbols of life, light, and mystery. From their beginnings as radiant, almost divine beings to their later roles as craftsmen, guardians, and even tricksters, elves show us humanity's deep curiosity and forces beyond our control. Their dual nature, both kind and dangerous, reflects how we've always seen the natural world, as something to admire, but also something to respect. Whether connected to fertility, immortality, or the afterlife, elves represent the unbreakable link between people, nature, and the divine. Their stories remind us of the incredible power of myth to help us to face the unknown, and their place in our culture ensures that their light, however complex, will keep shining always.